Listeners, a CIA officer, a Tory, and an actual historian walk into a bar and run into the National Rifle Association. Stay tuned to the Hidden History Happy Hour podcast. Welcome back, Alex, my friend.
Hey, good to see you.
And belated happy birthday to you.
Thank you
29
very
looks
much.
good on you.
I appreciate it. Even 30 looks all right.
Yeah, well, you're a little bit ahead of us on time, so maybe you're a year older there.
Okay.
Cheers, welcome back. I see no one's going to see my cheers with my tropical background.
You've got your tropical island on. They can see my cheers. Cheers.
All right, fair enough. So today, we're super excited. We had 4 great live shows in New York City at the amazing Von Bar, the official bar of the Hidden History Happy Hour. And most of those are out. Please check us out and subscribe. One surprise episode will come out at a later time. But today, it's great. We're returning to our old standard format. And I'm super excited to just tell some stories. Alex is going to tell a great cautionary tale for technological warfare in our time. But first, we're joined, perhaps Alex, our most authentic historian guest. I know we both admit that we're not that, but Joe Coolhill, Dr. Joe Coolhill, AKA on the interwebs, Professor Buzzkill, is the real deal. Yeah. Now, Alex, I'm going to tell Professor Buzzkill's bio in a minute. But first, I know how you love 2 things: craft beer and pub quizzes. So Joe, welcome aboard and ask Alex about camera and beer.
Alex, you must remember camera.
I do, of course.
Campaign for Real Ale.
Campaign for Real Ale. Good people.
Yes, very, very important thing happened in your blessed country. And I think, to my mind, started off the wonderful craft beer brew pub phenomenon that we've all loved ever since.
So I want to say that.
And one of the things I remember when I was living in England back in the 20th century was it was a fabulous camera-inspired ale called, and I hope this is a PG show.
Yep.
Oh no, we're fully family, fully non-family. Go ahead.
Okay. The name of the beer, and it had the most wonderful badge, that are on the pint pullers. It was called the Dog's Bollocks.
Yeah.
And it had, you remember this, yeah?
I've drunk a couple of pints of Dog's Bollocks.
It had a big sort of dog leaning back, man spreading or dog spreading his hind legs and his bollocks hanging down. So that got me through the 90s very well.
Well, and historian Dr. Professor Buzzkill. I'm going with the German phrasing, Dr. Professor Buzzkill. Okay. I think you can also confirm, as a matter of actual history, that this, to a great extent, spawned the craft beer movement in my country as well.
Well, I believe so. I believe it spawned it everywhere, because I remember the 70s and the 80s. Well, I wasn't drinking in the 70s, but I certainly remember in the 80s and even in the late 80s when I was living in Australia, the craft beer movement wasn't going on, and camera was starting in the UK. It started in the UK, if I remember right, around 85, 86, and really struggled very hard to fight against those big breweries and their power. So we're in debt to those people.
I couldn't agree more, and I think your timing is right, because I love the history of pubs, and I've looked up a lot of old pubs in old camera records. They used to have these manuals.
Yep.
The trouble is, if you look at those manuals from the 80s and the 90s, a lot of those pubs are closed now. The camera did great work, but nothing could stem the tide of pub closures in my country. It's many historic buildings turned into flats. That's the frustration. You see this beautiful old building, it was plainly a pub, coda at the end, now flats.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to mention this. I hate to bring up Oxford in front of at least one Cambridge people, but one of my favorite pubs when I was a graduate student was the Eagle and Child in Oxford, which had been home to the Inklings, J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, those people, and they would drink and talk literature, and I think that's closed now, and it's a tragedy.
Yeah, it's very sad. That's a story that's told, I'm afraid, all over my country, and I would just make one point, that I think the Eagle pub, as was the Eagle and Child, is in Cambridge, and just worth bearing that in mind.
Talk about buzzkill.
Because that's
the Eagle and Child that Tolkien and the boys went to.
No, I'm sure there was more than one, but the Eagle and Child in Cambridge, which is still there, which is now called the Eagle in Cambridge, has graffiti in the ceiling where RAF airmen about to go off on their flights would burn their names and messages into the roof, and that's still there.
Okay. Well, you've got us on that, but we got you in the boat race this year, so.
Okay.
Well, I would say that is at least a tie. If I had to drink to airmen in our RAF airmen in World War II or Tolkien, gosh, I work for a company that would hate to hear me say this, but I might go with the airmen.
Yeah,
but we digress.
Look, the other thing is our Eagle's still there and theirs isn't. So, you know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, now that we've established beyond all doubt Joe's bona fides as a graduate of England's premier university, I still will add that he teaches history at the University of Pittsburgh. Joe describes himself as a historian for the public. He works tirelessly to explain complicated yet compelling historical analysis to diverse audiences, as do we, Alex.
Amen.
He often speaks to civic, government, nonprofit, and business organizations about the nature of history and about how historical misunderstandings and mythology, much like our prior favorite guest, Mike Cole, not that you're not our favorite guest anymore, Mike, might be a tie, does as well. And so welcome, Joe. Welcome, Professor Buzzkill. Honored to have you. You're way ahead of us in the podcasting game. So we'll take some leads from you, hopefully. But I did want to say, before we get going, I couldn't find the dog's Bollocks here, but I did go out of my way to find a craft beer that I think really probably sums up this show about as good as anything. I don't know if you can see it with my weird background, but I'll just tell you, it's Arrogant Bastard Ale.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, it's
our
good.
Viewers and listeners can figure out why I selected Arrogant Bastard Ale, as well as some Irish whiskey, because professionally, Joe is an Irish historian.
British and Irish, yeah. Britain and Ireland in the 19th century, yeah.
Do you tell us a few words about your own podcast, Joe?
Please.
Yeah, the Professor Buzzkill podcast tries to correct myths and misconceptions about history. Myths, the urban legends of history, the gossip of history that people now believe is absolutely true, that J. Edgar Hoover was a cross-dresser, that there was cocaine in Coca-Cola, all sorts of things like that. And also the zillions of misquotations, misattributed quotations out there. But then we take it a step further. We say, well, there's a thing about cocaine and Coca-Cola, but people are using that myth to talk about the war on drugs, and that's a problem. They're using a faulty historical example to try to make a political argument. And I might happen to agree with that political argument in contemporary times, but the historical basis that they're using is often faulty. We try to do it as lightly as possible, but we often obviously have to tackle very serious subjects like Hitler or the American Civil War and things like that and Stalin that are very, very brutal.
Well, it's a great podcast, and we recommend our viewers listen to it. One story that I only mentioned this because you were talking about eagles and Oxford and Cambridge. One other story about the eagle in Cambridge that I will remember, and I really don't want to be punctured, so please don't examine too closely. is that when Watson and Crick were working to seek to explain the nature of DNA and explain the structure of DNA, they went to the pub at lunch. I think there's a sign in the Eagle to say this, but it's canonical in Cambridge, at least, that this is the case. And over lunch, they had a breakthrough, a brainwave, and they hammered out the 20, whatever it is, I'm not a scientist, as you can tell, the 20 amino acids that were going to be the key part of working out what DNA was. And they did it in the pub at lunch. That's where I want my scientific discoveries to be made. So if it's not true, please don't tell me.
And
all right,
this is also,
I won't tell you.
but there is something
there is something about that story that is true. After they had discovered it, they'd made the initial breakthrough. The pub that Watson and Crick went to for lunch, or maybe after work, I think it was the Eagle, and I'm sure that's the case. And Watson says in his famous book, scientists always try to be careful about bragging too much too early. So I was a little discombobulated when Francis and I walked into the Eagle, and he announced to everyone that we found the meaning of we've discovered the origin of life. Yes. And I think it's that pub, that very pub.
There is a certain bar in McLean, Virginia, where, contrary to every security directive any Central Intelligence Agency officer ever received, many historically famous operations were concocted over a paper napkin and a couple of martinis, usually around noon. And I'm pretty sure, Alex, we learned that tradecraft from the special executive in World War II.
Special operations executive, yeah.
Special operations executive, yeah. Now, I have to say, I am both heartened, Joe, that you're doing this great debunking work, and saddened. And I'm so saddened, I'm going to have to open my arrogant bastard now because, Alex,
yeah,
Joe, in our little pre-show discussion, that's how the magic happens, folks, debunked something I use all the time and I love, and I've actually been relying on for my sanity. And that is Churchill's supposed saying that Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted all of their options. And when things get really dark looking, like let's say a recent hearing on January 6th, I always think, hey, maybe we're just in our exhaustion period. But Joe corrected me, and alas, Churchill, for all of his greatness, apparently never said that.
Yeah, I didn't. It wasn't. I never felt it was my place to correct you, and I'm too lazy to have looked it up. But I always had a kind of query on that one. Because it's too similar to democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other kinds, except for all of the other options. Right. And I'm mangling the exact phrase, but he definitely did say that, I think. And it just felt like your America one was too similar to that to actually be something that he said. But you seem so happy with it that I to disabuse you.
Not having it in my repertoire will increase my blood pressure substantially, but I don't have to do that because Joe informed me who did actually say it. And it was an Israeli leader, wasn't it, Joe?
It was an Israeli diplomat, and I apologize to all our Israeli friends if I mispronounce it, Adas Iban, who said it in the 1950s in the United Nations. And the saving grace for us Americans is that he didn't say Americans will do the right thing after they've exhausted. He said men and nations have a tendency to do the right thing after. So it was much more universal. So it isn't just us.
Well, good.
According to him,
good. That's better.
It's everyone. He was a very, very, very powerful and influential sort of second tier below the media gaze diplomat and politician, world diplomat and politician.
So, Joe, as we record this in late June of 2022, as always in my country, there have been a number of mass shootings and a number of legal actions around gun laws. And since you have devoted at least a number of your episodes to debunking myths of the National Rifle Association, we definitely want to get into that with you. But first, I think we'd love to hear Alex's story of a missile mishap.
Thank you very much, Brian. This is a story about the Harpoon missile system, which is created by an American business. But this is not a story about the American military. This powerful bit of kit was sold to different forces around the world, and it constituted the main firepower of two frigates in the noble Danish Navy. The two naval vessels in question were the Peter Skram and her sister ship, the Herluf Troll. And if I've mangled those pronunciations, don't complain.
You'll hear
to me.
about it.
Yeah, I know. Don't complain to me. They may sound very abusive as I say them, but neither of them are my fault. And I'm going to concentrate on the Peter Skram. These missiles were so punchy that the Danes had only fired them twice in the history of having them equipped on their boat. The first was the test firing. The second, which was successful. And the second time the missile was fired is not so successful a story. We rewind to September 1982. The Peter Skram is out on mission, pootling down from our house on the way to a NATO exercise in the Baltic. Hey, comes the order from the captain. We better check our super duper missile launcher and make sure that it's all in working order, right? So the man responsible for it was a commander called Olsen, and he checked over various bits and pieces, and safe in the knowledge that the launch key was securely below deck, he thought there was no way the missile could be fired. And for launch key, remember, the keys around Sean Connery's neck in The Hunt for Red October and so forth. So in order to, exactly, so in order to check that yes, good reference. And I can't.
Gene Hackman, Denzel Washington, and an adorable little puppy.
Yes, and he punches Washington. I remember. it's a great scene of dignity, actually, in the face of aggression, that scene that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so Olsen is sorting through the various pre-use protocols on the missile system, and it talks you through, as long as the firing key isn't in place, do this, do that, do the other, and to dry fire, to empty fire the chamber, press the launch key to ensure that the system is connected and is working. No chance of it firing, of course, because the launch key,
no launch key, yeah,
the launch key is in place. So, of course, as per the manual instruction, he presses the launch button. Whoosh! Oh God, Olsen no doubt said, as some 628 kilograms of prime missile shot over his head and launched off in the general direction of Copenhagen. Well, this is awkward. Ruin your day. This is awkward. The crew, the Peter Scram, no doubt thought as they saw their own missile heading towards their capital. The missiles were a fire and forget system, which means you just press the button and off it goes. There is no source programmable guidance, which is a phrase I remember because it's in a Dan Aykroyd Chevy Chase movie called Spies Like Us, where they managed to recall the missile or change the missile's flight. This is a fire and forget missile. You press the button, off it goes. Once it's gone, and you can't detonate it remotely either. So that's they thought they'd really fired a missile into urban Denmark.
Seems like good planning.
Yeah, well, quite. Luckily for our nautical Danes in this story, Brian and Joe, and indeed even luckier for their compatriots on land and in Copenhagen, the harpoon, it was designed for flight over sea. It was designed to go and blow up other ships and blow up ports and jetties and so forth. So it couldn't really cope. It turns out they learned
so to speak.
Use. Yeah, indeed, it couldn't really cope with adjusting its flight path for things like trees and houses and so forth. So 4 minutes into flight, 34 kilometers from the ship, the missile, which the Danes have christened the Oops missile in their history of it, the Oops missile, which
funnier.
Hovska missile in Danish, and if I've mispronounced that, don't let me know.
That sounds good, though.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hovska missile hit a tree, and the circa 220 kg warhead exploded then and there. It wiped out 4 holiday cottages and damaged in the region 130 other buildings. It's in a town called Lamas. Injuries to individuals? 0, none. Wow. Not one person affected, not a soul. At which point it can become funny, and you can enjoy laughing at what the Danish sailors must have felt like when that rocket went off their ship. Coda, there was a review. Yeah, hey, I reckon this missile can be fired without the key in it. There's a technical problem, I think, said the review. Well, no kidding, said Olsen, the most relieved Dane in the history of Denmark. It's even possible, I suppose, although I don't commit myself to this, that he might have showed some kind of emotion, the flickering of a smile, perhaps. But I can't commit to that. And of Joe is setting very high standards as historians, so I'm not going to.
Well, we'll say the most emotion since Hamlet.
Well, quite. Exactly. But even then, it might
makes
not
me
have
melancholy.
But it might not have been detectable to us as Westerners. So I'm not going to commit to it. But politicians and media types really don't like to have accidents without having somebody to blame. And unsurprisingly, this incident, the blameless Olsen, who'd done exactly what he was supposed to do in each stage of the maintenance of the missile, was hounded for years in the course of his nautical career. And in the end, the manufacturer of the missile made a goodwill payment to Denmark to cover the costs of the cottages and so forth. So sort of an admission of fault from their end. So in my view, it's a bit funny, and it's only a bit funny because it's injury-free. But the lesson from life is a bit like double-checking you haven't hit reply all, except with rather more consequence. Even if you're sure that something isn't loaded, and even if you know something can't fire, don't pull the trigger whilst pointing it at anything you care about, whether it be Copenhagen or something else.
Well, that is a great story. And it actually is a great transition, because having been through some firearms training of my own, rule 1, or maybe this is rule 2, is do not ever aim a weapon in a direction of something you do not want to kill. unless you're on a target range, of course, a safe target range. And so what happens is they have this massive capability. Technology thinks they've outsmarted human nature, and it still went wrong. So one thing to think about there is, be careful what you buy and arm yourself with, because something might happen you don't intend.
I got to say, Dane's never fired one again.
Well, that now, of course, the irony will be they'll actually go to war and it won't work. But they had 40 years to figure it out. So hopefully they have. I wonder, is there any hint in the story? I doubt it, Alex, or you would have mentioned it, that there was some sort of translation error in the training manual when they translated?
No, I've never seen that suggested. It was as simple as I read a design flaw about the process of going through the various preparation for launch stages, which meant that in some circumstances, despite the absence of the launch key, the missile could fire. I am sure that they've rectified it since.
Yeah, Joe, we'll get on to our main topic in a second, but any thoughts on either this story or famous military mishaps that never happened, or what are your thoughts?
Well, it reminds me, although in a different sort of way, there are a number of potential missile launches during the Cold War that got stopped just before the missiles went off. And I think we did a show on a Soviet commander,
Petrov.
We definitely did.
Yeah, we did.
We did a show on Petrov. Yeah.
And when I was interviewing
he's on the front of my book
about the,
yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. There you go. Exactly.
Yeah. Show us, Alex. Yeah. That's Petrov. Although it looks a little bit like Alex Dean in a Soviet army uniform also.
I'll take it.
Is this Vasily Petrov? Is that?
Now you've got. Yes, I'm going to.
Well, I think
but
that's
there are
right.
a number of these examples, and apparently this has happened, a handful of times. Well, this did happen a handful of times in the Cold War.
Right.
Yeah, Alex has a great one about a bear that almost started World War III. Not a metaphorical Soviet bear, an actual brown bear. Or black bear,
and on that one, I've always been corrected on the pronunciation because I on reading it, thought it was Duluth, but I gather from Americans it's Duluth.
Duluth.
If Americans can mispronounce something, you will.
Decent craft beer in Duluth, by the way.
Is that a Duluth product, the one that you're having?
No, not this one, but they have good craft beer there.
Right, so
Brian, I just want to mention again, the theme of the show is that we only have craft beer in every part of this world now because of camera.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
I tease Alex, but I always give UK credit where credit is due. And apparently in the case of Churchill, I give the UK too much credit.
So I consulted my book, and it's Stanislav Petrov was the guy's name. And the Duluth story, to cut it very short for you, Joe, is that the alarm was sounded at the Duluth missile base, which ordered guys at Volk Field to get in. The wrong alarm went off. Rather than we may have an intruder, it said, prepare to scramble. And these nuclear-tipped fighter jets were rolling down the runway. And it turns out that the ultra alert sentry doing his duty, and it wasn't his fault, the wrong alarm had sounded by dint of mechanical error, had actually misidentified a bear climbing over the fence at Duluth Missile Command and was blazing away at a brown bear, which nearly started a nuclear war.
Yeah. Monty Python calls that a missed opportunity. Joe, we wanted to talk with you about anything you want to talk about, but specifically, I was fascinated by your couple of episodes of the Professor Buzzkill podcast that talk about the history of the National Rifle Association, and I learned a lot I didn't know about the NRA. In particular, I learned it is not an American creation, is it?
No, it borrowed quite deliberately from the British National Rifle Association, which was founded in the 1860s, I believe. Part of the reason was that after the Civil War, Union Army commanders in the United States Army, the sort of analysts in the military who always do this work after the battles are done.
After action report,
yeah. They had calculated. Now it's hard to know how accurate this was, but that of every 1,000 rounds fired by a Union soldier, only one hit a Confederate soldier. And part of this was blamed on poor technology and bad rifling within inside the chamber of the rifle the barrel of the rifle. But mostly they blamed it on marksmanship, poor marksmanship. And this is funny coming from, the mythology of America is you've got the backwoods Daniel Boone, the great marksman and hunting squirrels and fighting Native Americans and, these crack shots and everything. And then turns out that they weren't crack shots. And so the National Rifle Association was founded in New York, modeled completely on the British National Rifle Association in 1871. Also because, and again, this is a sort of another European reason for the existence of the NRA, the Franco-Prussian War was going on. And the big thing that happened during the Franco-Prussian War, at least for historians, there are a lot of things, but the big thing in terms of innovation was it was really the first time that, modern rifled cannon and modern rifled rifles, right?
Yep.
And you know what I mean by rifling,
Yep.
were used extensively and had improved to the point where marksmanship really started to matter. So the Americans felt themselves very behind the British, certainly behind the French and certainly behind the Prussians, and the NRA was founded for that reason, to improve American marksmanship and to compete against the British, compete against other countries in world marksmanship championships.
So just for any of our listeners who don't know what rifling is, people talk about a shotgun versus a rifle. A weapon can have a metal barrel that's entirely smooth inside, or it can have ridges cut in it, usually in a spiral shape of some sort, that, and now I'm over my skis on engineering, but somehow improves the accuracy of the weapon. So the kind of industrialization of rifling is the advance you're talking about. I can't help, though, but just reflect on, if I were an after action officer at the end of the Civil War, I don't know if this would be second on my list to look at, but it certainly wouldn't be first on my list. First on my list would be how it was that in the Revolutionary War, or the Great War of British Oppression, or whatever you guys call it, we knew how to guerrilla fight. And yet somehow 70 years later, you had all these set battles of just rows of human cannon fodder approaching each other across the field. Like, what happened in those 70 years, I asked rhetorically, that we decided not to do that anymore?
Well, I don't know. That probably was a higher priority after action question. But one of the after action questions was well, at any rate, enough sort of bigwigs in the shooting world believed that American marksmanship was poor and was in danger of really falling behind this fantastic British and European marksmanship that was accelerating in the 1870s.
There's another interesting thing that I have read of conflicts more generally around that time, not just that one, which was that more often than not, a man would miss because subconsciously or consciously he didn't really want to hit what he was shooting at. There is something in us that very often doesn't want to take the life of the person at the other end.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. I'm not an expert in that, but what I mean when I explain this is that this is what the NRA said.
Right.
And it's all its founding documents, everything. We are founding this because we need better marksmanship in this country. The modern world, unfortunately, has these horrible wars and these horrible weapons of war. But we are going to lose if there's ever a world war.
Which soon enough there was.
Improve that.
Yeah. In general,
sorry, Brian. The perils of thinking out loud. I remember now that it was during my reading about Vietnam that it was the number of profligate ammunition use incidents where Marines had sprayed tens of hundreds of rounds towards the enemy and hit nothing. The Vietnamese were a great deal more accurate, and one evaluation was that the Vietnamese really did want to hit what they were shooting at, and many of the GIs did not.
Well, that's also a little bit of a function of, by this time in Vietnam, we had fully automatic weapons. And one of the first things I was taught in government firearms training is, even if you have your hands on an automatic weapon, which you probably would not as a general practice CIA officer, you almost never want to use it as an automatic weapon because it's wildly inaccurate. You always want to aim and fire. And a huge part of the skill of surviving is keeping your head enough so that when the automatic fire is coming towards you but not hitting you, you can still aim your shots. So that's another piece of it. But speaking of Vietnam, Alex, now that you so masterfully scored well on my first pub quiz, I'm so disappointed. I'm going to hit you with another one. And that is this idea of the after action report determining that the military units needed a lot more accuracy echoes through history, at least fictional history, a certain motion picture that has recently been revived in a sequel. Alex, do you know what I'm referring to?
Top Gun Maverick.
And that's the opening voiceover of the original Top Gun, is that, at least according to the movie, this is why the fighter weapons school was founded, because in Korea, we were terrible. And in Vietnam, we got a lot better, and they wanted to figure out how to teach that in terms of shooting down airplanes.
Right.
Apologies, Joe. Please proceed.
No. I mean, I know very little about after action reports in general and how they're accomplished. But what historians have always admired about the military is they don't, or at least the militaries that I know, they don't rely on just, oh, well, we won.
Right.
They just, I mean, the amount of post D-Day analysis, for instance, is just astounding. And so we're very grateful as historians because we get all this information, right? All this source material. But it's very, very impressive how the military is able to really look at itself and say, well, this didn't work, and we think it's because of this. Now, they might be wrong, but that
they go through the process.
They're not doing a Napoleonic, we won because we're French or whatever. There's
right.
they're very serious and rigorous examinations.
The last time I served in the U.S. government, which was 20 years ago, almost now 18, the Department of Defense in the United States had, and I'm not making this number up, in the range of 50,000 officers whose title included the word planning.
Yeah.
And these were both future planners and after action people. And even the tiniest little overnight commando raid in Afghanistan with 3 guys, they would go through that, whether it was successful or not.
Right. Well, we're grateful anyway. Professional historians are very grateful.
So now the NRA is founded in the United States. One of our presidents was president of the NRA, if I'm not mistaken. Or
yes, I think it was Taft. I could be wrong about that.
I thought it was U.S. So we can cut this. I thought U.S. Grant became an early president
you're
of
probably
the NRA.
Right.
And I thought it was Theodore Roosevelt. So,
well, okay.
No, I think
so
Grace, just cut to Grant.
Grace, just cut to Joe saying, "Yes, that's right, Brian."
I think we should leave the whole segment in. All right.
Yes, that's right, Brian.
But the point, but whoever it is, the point is, it was a very targeted, no pun intended, purpose for which it was created, with the full support of the United States military and political leadership.
And there's no question that it had the full support, more or less, of the country. If you had sat down with people at the time and said and explained it, they would have said, well, sure. People who remembered the Civil War remembered how much butchery there was. And if marksmanship can actually decrease butchery, right, improve marksmanship can decrease butchery, then that's a good thing. And also all the East Coast elites from Washington up to Boston, they're reading the European news like crazy, and their eyes are extremely wide at these technological advancements by the French and the Prussians. So it is, it's the obvious thing to do. Now,
right.
what do you want me to move on to how that then changed?
Yeah, when does it go awry, Joe? In your view?
What happens is they start running these shooting competitions or start participating in worldwide shooting competitions and actually start winning. When they defeat the British Imperial team for the first time, I think in the early 1890s.
Please spend as long as you want on that.
It's a huge celebration in the American sporting world and in the American military world. But gradually, the NRA also starts to expand about hunting, because remember, the United States is also changing dramatically in the early 20th century. The big New Deal projects, dams, and all that sort of stuff are completely changing an awful lot of the landscape in the country. So a lot of traditional deer hunting grounds are being submerged, and wildlife is having to be moved. Deer. I come from I'm in Pennsylvania, very hunting heavy state. A lot of deer populations get very concentrated because a lot of changes are being made. So the NRA adds to it the idea that we need to increase and protect, or at least promote responsible hunting. And that's very, very popular. Boy Scout troops are given awards by NRA, local NRA chapters for shooting competitions for the Boy Scouts, and all that. All that stuff really continues perfectly normally, with almost no opposition from anybody. Even during the so-called crime waves of the 30s and the mob era and all that sort of stuff, there isn't really much call for gun control until the 1960s, partly because of the assassinations, partly because there's a proliferation of very cheap handguns throughout the United States. And then after the assassinations of President Kennedy, then Martin Luther King, then Bobby Kennedy, LBJ puts together a gun control act. And apart from one aspect of it, which was gun registration, the NRA supports the act completely. And by the way, that gun registration is left out of the act, but there are all kinds of other measures.
You have a great. Sorry, Joe. I was just going to say you have
Sorry.
I was just going to say you have a. I'm going to plug your show, Joe. You have a great clip on one of your episodes, which we'll put in the show notes, of the LBJ's essentially verbal signing statement, his speech when he announced the signing, and he very persuasively calls that out, and he says, not that this legislation I'm signing is worthless, but essentially this will not get the job done until we can have national registration.
Yeah, and mostly LBJ in that speech and pro-gun control people at that time were not anti-NRA, because the NRA was extremely moderate, mostly very level-headed. There were other more extreme gun groups, and they're worried about groups like the Black Panthers, that when the Black Panthers show up in California Assembly with guns, even though it's perfectly legal, people freak. And President Truman's life had been threatened in the mid-50s, in the late 40s by Puerto Rican nationalists with handguns.
Yeah, across the street, Blair House.
Yeah. So there and the NRA would never have, and in those days would never have defended these things, right? So the NRA, if you will, is still a very moderate gun organization, concentrating mostly on marksmanship, but especially by the 60s, really looking into the outdoor life. So what they don't want is government cracking down on people that want to have rifles for outdoorsmanship. And in fact, the NRA is by the mid-1970s, thinking of moving itself to Denver to emphasize that we are now a Western, we're in a shooting, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
It's not marksmanship. We've got the military to handle that now. We're going to concentrate on expanding hunting grounds, expanding national park places where we can hunt, and all that sort of stuff. There's this very small group in the late 60s and mid 70s in the NRA, fewer than 500 people, who, because of what they perceive as rising crime, especially rising racial crime, people are terrified to death, the Martin Luther King riots and things like that in the 60s and 70s. They get very, very paranoid about gun control. And so whereas the bulk of the NRA is pro-gun control, at least up until and not including registration, there's this hardcore minority that's starting to treat it as a religious, almost cultish devotion to the Second Amendment.
Right. You're telling me something that I absolutely didn't know. Just say that again. Until the majority of the NRA were in favor of gun control, at least up until registration.
Sounds like the vast majority.
This is fascinating. Yeah. And until the early 70s.
Well, what happens
a little later,
actually. There's a group of these hardcore radicals in the NRA in the mid 70s start to really, and the idea is we're gonna have to take over the NRA in order to protect what we believe the Second Amendment says. And so at the famous 1977 annual meeting in Cincinnati, they do that, and they do it through sort of parliamentary tactics, and the NRA was a sort of, like a huge Rotary Club or something. Everyone voted, everyone talked, voting from the floor, blah, blah, blah. Well, these guys figured out they could very strategically work the meeting and work the agenda and vote everyone off of the board of directors and everything else. And they did all this in 1977 in Cincinnati and started making the NRA move into a much more extreme version where they frankly forget about hunting, right? And they work from then on purely preventing almost any legislation about gun control.
I'm just going to take a wild guess here, completely uninformed guess. Would this possibly have also coincided with a massive ramp up in their national fundraising activities?
No, that happens afterwards. So they also becomes very sophisticated. They become very sophisticated. The idea is the sort of paranoia leaks in that gun control is going to take away. Yeah. Right. And so a man named Harlan Carter very, very shrewdly gets involved in massive fundraising, massive membership drives, and also massive legislative pressure.
Yeah.
So the NRA becomes a lobbying group for the first time.
I was on a Senate campaign in 1984 for a liberal Democrat, Tom Harkin, in Iowa, very heavy hunting state. And so I was in the grassroots, and this was really the first big Senate race where the newly reconstituted NRA, the religious right, and some of the other far right groups started to really work together to target seats. And my guy was one of them. And I probably spoke with dozens, if not hundreds, of literally card-carrying, paper card NRA members in Iowa who absolutely had no idea what their dues money was being spent on in Washington. Right. And if you asked them any of these legislative priorities of the DC NRA, they would say, I don't know what you're talking about. I just want my kid to get certified.
Right, exactly. And what starts to happen now, remember, as I say in my show, so the episode that we just released Thursday, a few days ago, talks about this. And before the episode, I sort of have this long introduction and where I compare the time period from 1977 to now is roughly the same, almost 50 years, as the time period from from 1800 to 1850, when the sectional crisis and the Civil War start. And during that time period, because of the improvements in cotton production, slavery becomes a sort of sacred thing to Southerners, especially Southern elites and Southern plantation owners. And whereas there's been, slavery is always evil and always immoral, but in the founding generation had sort of ambivalent ideas about, they banned the slave trade, but we, we don't know what to do with it. They're unhappy with the morals of it, but it's like the way the world is. Well, in those 50 years of the first half of the 19th century, the slave owners start to believe that God granted them slavery, and that slavery is what made the British Empire great, the Roman Empire great, the Greek Empire great, the Egyptian Empire great. It is the natural order of things, and that vision gets so extreme by the outbreak of the Civil War that all the leading Confederates are saying it as not only the number one reason for the Civil War, but the number one basis upon which their entire society is based. And that sort of development, right, is, to me, parallels with the NRA. So the NRA, for most of its history, is normal, if you will, and more or less unobjectionable. But in these last 50 years, because of what these things that they've come to believe, those things that then just steamroll and they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And if I say, look, I don't want assault weapons or I don't want these kinds of things, people, that's where the slippery slope thing.
You're challenging God.
Yeah, well, you're challenging God, and you're telling, and there are these awful companies now that have these. Daniel Defense is one of them. Have these ads in which they have an assault rifle in a child's lap, and the ad just has a verse from Proverbs over it, saying something. As a young man, teach him in the wage of righteousness, and he'll grow up to be righteous, or something like that, with a gun.
So,
and
Joe,
then they have other ones that have where they have an assault rifle with a crucifix dangled over it, almost like a rosary, saying "He is risen." And I'm not the world's greatest Christian, but I'm pretty sure that it's not in the Bible that rifles are Christian.
Joe, you don't know this. My father was an Episcopal minister, the stepchild of the Church of England, and So I say this with a certain amount of humility, but I think, Alex, it's already midway through the episode time. We can announce one of our lessons from history, whether it's in English or Russian. Beware the natural order of things.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that's true.
Anytime somebody invokes that, you're about to get whacked. But go ahead.
Well, and I came up with that parallel because as I say, I don't want anyone to misapprehend what I'm saying. The justifications for slavery have always been wrong and always been immoral, but they deepened so greatly in the first 50 years of the 19th century that it's shocking what the Confederates say in the 1850s. And the paranoia and the slippery slope arguments following this 1977 transformation of the NRA lead to these unbelievably shocking things you see gun manufacturers and gun rights organizations do. I had a student recently, and I won't say what semester or anything like that, who wore a T-shirt into class. So now remember, this is Pennsylvania, so it's a shooting state. Wore a T-shirt in the class that said, it had a bunch of bullets on, or guns on one side, and the numbers of their calibers on the other, right, listed down the things. And then said, I don't call 911 because I have these numbers to protect me.
Right.
I mean, this is, this is genuinely a national illness. And we see the effects of that damn near every week.
Well, let me stop you there. I think this is a really good jumping off point. And for people who want to know more about the various eras of the NRA, Joe's got just amazing podcasts about it that go into great depth. But Alex, I know you've spoken a little bit about this. Joe just said that we, meaning Americans, have this national disease. And it's hard to disagree with that on this issue. Why don't you have it in the UK? Why don't they have it in Australia? Why don't they have it in New Zealand? Or do they?
In none of those countries do we really have that issue. And in part, it's because we, over the course of the 20th century, greatly tightened our control over what guns you could buy and own at the same time that you were liberalizing yours. And sad to say, but perhaps predictable, these things were sparked in both my country and in Australia by tragedies. They were sparked by mass killings. And I don't mean to make light of any of those things, indeed quite the reverse, but I simply point out that it feels so wrong when we see these stories often, recently, I think two on the same day in the United States of mass killings in which don't seem to produce the same kind of results amongst your lawmakers. Right? And the one thing I would say about this and I hope it doesn't sound too self-serving or thinking too much about my own political tribe, but I would refute any suggestion that this is a conservative position or belief or a necessarily conservative position to take, that you should be very laissez-faire when it comes to people owning automatic weapons and so forth. My great political hero in the conservative movement, John Howard, who was a long-serving leader of the Liberal Party in Australia, which is their conservative party, after their Port Arthur massacre, in which many people had, I think 30 plus people had been killed, he instituted a remarkable set of buybacks, 2 rounds of buybacks to, I think, somewhere north of 1.5 million weapons off the street in Australia, and bans and restrictions on what you could buy in the future. Now, Australia, of course, at the time had a lower population than it does now, and if you think about their population now, is about 30 million now. It was perhaps in the mid to high 20s. At the time, 1.5 million guns coming off the streets, a very significant proportion of the population that had weapons at that time. I know it's not quite getting up to having more guns than people, but it's a lot of weapons. And he took that decision, which was very unpopular with some people and very unpopular with some people on his own side. And I remember we've come up recently to one of the anniversaries of that massacre in Australia, and they interviewed John Howard, who was reflecting on it, and he said, I just felt that if I couldn't do something about this, then I wasn't up to the job.
Yeah.
And I think that's the right mentality.
Yeah, and I would argue to reinforce what you said, Alex, not only is this radical interpretation of our Second Amendment not conservative, because that wasn't the interpretation for how Joe can tell us 200, 180 years. It's radical. It's a radical redefining of something that neither the founding fathers in the Federalist Papers, nor, as far as I can tell, Joe, anyone in any of the debates ever in Congress up until the time period you're talking about argued that was the Second Amendment meaning.
I think the whole NRA argument and the whole NRA cultish belief in what they now believe is outside the normal range of left and right, conservative, reform, whatever you want to call it. It's in its own little sphere of weirdness and mental illness, if you will. If anything, Alex, it represents some of the more. It's more like some of the extreme views held on other topics, like the Democratic Unionists in Northern Ireland. So what things really impressed me about Australian conservatives and the British Conservative government is they both of those cabinets immediately said, yes, we need to do this, and they led their countries. And I'll push back with you a little bit, because I remember the Australian experience, and I remember I think the majority, and someone would have to fact check me on this, the vast majority of Australian gun owners very, very willingly turned over their guns and agreed with this.
No, sure.
Yes,
you're right. It was a minority opposition, but it was vociferous, and it was largely on his own political side.
Right. But the key, as you rightly point out with John Howard, is and I hate to say this, he stuck to his guns. You know, this was the right thing to do. And after Dunblane in Scotland, I think that happened under a Tory administration.
But by then we had already instituted a large number of. Dunblane was a school massacre, Brian, and in one Scotland. Of the strange coincidences of modern life, and as we're recording this, the Wimbledon Tennis Championships is being played. Britain's leading tennis player Andy Murray was a student at the school. But by the time that Dunblane happened, most of our restrictions on what weapons you could buy in the UK were already in place, because there was an earlier massacre in a place called Hungerford, in which a guy took to a church tower, I think it was. If it wasn't a church tower, it was a clock tower, and systematically set about murdering some of his fellow Hungerfordians.
Is that the basis of the Boomtown Rats song, I Don't Like Mondays, Alex, or is that a different shooting? Or do you know?
I don't think that is. I don't think it is.
Well, we'll look it up.
Yeah.
The reason,
the key
Joe,
difference to me is that the politicians did it.
Right. No, I follow. I follow.
The politicians did it. Even if there was a hardcore opposition from minority opposition within their own parties, they did it. And yes, you're right. Britain was far ahead of Australia in terms of getting rid of restrictions on guns, but after both Hungerford and Dunblane, they went all the way and finished it off. And no sane person in Britain disagrees with this. It's just
there's certainly no lobby in my country saying let's liberalize our gun laws. That's just most of our police are unarmed. But there's an interesting facet to what Brian's asked me that I think may demonstrate how long-standing this discussion is. I mean, the Boomtown Rats are not a good band, and haven't really been writing stuff for nigh on 50 years. So that's the first point, is it was inspired by a massacre a while ago. The second,
Food Aid, though.
Oh yeah, okay, well, all right. And Bob Geldof's political posturing is not something you want to attach yourself to. But the point I was going to make was, unless I've misremembered things, he was inspired by reports of an American massacre when he wrote that song. Now,
that may be right.
If I'm wrong, we'll
it may be the San Diego one. I think you might be right.
I don't know. I don't know where in the States it was. I just remember that was my recollection.
Well, I don't think as poorly of the song as you do, but I think we are right. We'll put it in the
name another Boomtown Rat song.
I didn't say
there
I
you go.
I said I don't think as badly about the song as you do. Also, Boomtown Rats is a cool name. Anyway,
agreed.
The reason I, Joe, keyed in on this national disease point, and the reason I kind of derailed the discussion, which I, make no bones about, when we are on your podcast, you can derail our discussion, is there are, as Alex pointed out, and as LBJ said even 50 years ago, more weapons on the streets in the United States than there are people, or I guess in LBJ's time, families.
Yeah,
and so
crucially, LBJ said in '68 said we now have more firearms than families, and that was a shocking statement then.
And now it's
now
humans.
we have more firearms than humans.
Yes, so that's a very sad thing, but that's also my point, which is that I should, just to keep things fair and balanced, note that as we're recording this, our Senate and House of Representatives president in the United States have now agreed, signed into law, the first gun control legislation in 3 decades. Now, it's not very strong, but it's the first time anyone has stood up to the NRA in the United States, and they got 14 or so Republican votes. So I would say all is not lost, but I would also say, as long as there are this many weapons on the streets, not to make a bad pun, but don't we need to treat the disease more than the weapons? I mean, if we don't change our attitude, it doesn't matter how many guns.
You mean the guns are the symptoms, not the cause?
And also, like, we've lost that battle. I mean, I don't think there's enough warehouse space or money to buy back all the dangerous weapons on the streets of the U.S. Not that I'm saying we shouldn't try, but we have to change attitudes.
I follow you. Yeah.
Well, I think the more people that I wish a lot more Americans would live abroad, at least for a short period of time. I've lived in Australia and I've lived in Britain in 2 stages. And not only but every American that I know that's been in similar situations, after about 6 or 8 months, coming on to a year, after you're living in a place like that, this feeling that comes over you, you realize, oh, I'm not going to get shot.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, I had to take my son to school every day, and he went to school very close to a synagogue in Pittsburgh named the Tree of Life, which is where a huge shooting was. Yeah. It's just shocking that we never had active shooter drills when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s. And now they're just he talks about active shooter drills if it's just, there was a different sort of lunch period. It's shockingly insane.
Your point about that, travel broadens the mind is a cliche because it's true. And what you've just said is an argument that I often use in the course of much more mundane debates, because people have quite a myopic perspective, a very narrow attitude about the healthcare settlement in my country or our national broadcaster, and they can't imagine things being any different, and you just wish they'd lived abroad for a while. So much more profound to your point. Live in a country that does where people walking around with guns isn't normal, which is to say most of the world.
Yeah, and it is really a feeling that comes over you unconsciously. It's just all of a sudden, oh, that's right. I'm not.
Well, there's sort of a grand tradition here in the U.S. every presidential election where the party who thinks the other party's leader is extreme, which I guess is every election now, will say, if so-and-so gets elected, I'm moving to Canada, or if so-and-so gets elected, I'm moving to the UK. And I've never said that because, I think I feel patriotically inspired to support the American experiment. I will say, though, a friend of mine who I was having this kind of debate with about guns said to me, well, yeah, Canada has a lot of problems too, but I don't have to worry about my kid getting massacred in school. And my daughters are both grown, but God willing, they'll be granddaughters someday, and our sons, and or non-binary people. And it's something you got to think about, honestly.
Yeah, every country, we all have all of the same exact problems. I could get hit by a bus here, I could get hit by a bus in the UK, I could fall off a cliff here, I could fall off a cliff there, but only in the United States am I going to get shot.
Yeah, although on the flip side, only in Amsterdam are you likely to be run over by an angry mob of cyclists.
That's true. So or in Denmark, hit by a stray missile.
The oops missile. We're drawing on.
So we've come full circle.
We have. I just wanted to give one bit of a data point to reinforce the extent of the history behind your true meaning of the NRA marksmanship point. and its heritage in my country, because I've been noodling this out as you were talking, and I was thinking about the fact that there are many, and this is not, I'm not being smutty, it's just what they're called. There are many parts, there are many areas in my country, parts of villages and towns, which are called butts. So the streets are often butts this and butts that. And I live near one, there's one called Newington Butts. And the butts were where you were obliged to go and practice your archery. It was compulsory. And it was very often near the church, which is how a lot of these names have survived in the lane next to the church, because it was convenient on the Sunday after having gone and worshipped to undertake your national duty, because you might be called up if you were a man between the age of 15 and whatever the other upper age was, to practice your archery. And that was the case for hundreds of years. It was about improving marksmanship in order that if you were required to serve your country in time of war, you would be ready and able to. And that was a tradition that we had. I think it was the 13th century it began in my country. Certainly by Agincourt it had been in place in 1415, been in place for a long time. So that is a long and noble heritage, well before the founding of America, that demonstrates that the purpose of these organizations as they were constituted was about marksmanship and not about putting a gun in every person's hand in civilian life.
And as you mentioned that, Alex, I'm going to make this up as I go along, which is always dangerous, but that possibly could be one of the historical antecedents for the phrase that is the center of the debate in our country about the Second Amendment, which opens the amendment by saying a well-regulated militia being something like necessary for self-defense or something. I'm mangling the
security of a free state. Yeah.
Yes, that. Yes, very important. It may be that was part of what was in the heads of the framers when they wrote that amendment. Now, I will say, as a constitutional lawyer now, putting on my lawyer hat, or beard, wig, not beard, lawyer wig, that I wish more people on all sides of our debate would treat the Bill of Rights a little more equally. So we have lots of Democrats who believe the First Amendment is absolute, which it's not, and the Second Amendment means nothing, which it does mean something, and vice versa on the right. You know, I don't actually think it's worth assigning too much value to which amendment is literally sequentially first, second, or third, but it's not
technically
rational.
They're all equal.
And it's not rational constitutionally to say
there's certainly no
one
hierarchy,
has more force than the other.
No.
It doesn't make sense, and a lot of our scholars do it. And Joe, we've taken way too much of your time.
No, it's been
we
great.
could go on for hours. It's fascinating. And next time, I just want you to criticize Alex's history more. That's my only request.
Everyone's got to go and listen to the Professor Buzzkill podcast.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Thank you, gentlemen. Cheers.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, here I'm raising a mug of the dog's bollocks.
Cheers to that.